So I've just finished Less Than Zero by Bret Easton Ellis, his debut novel, and this was an experience. This was an emotional roller coaster. So we've got to talk about it. I've wanted to read Bret Easton Ellis's oeuvre for a while. Everyone was telling me to start with American Psycho, but being a natural contrarian, I of course wrote that one off immediately. Then I thought maybe I'll read The Shards because that's like his most recent work. But no, I thought let's go back to the start, let's read his debut. And so I read Less Than Zero, and oh boy, what a book. The first three quarters of this book, I was somewhat bored. So much so that I was just thinking like, okay, I need you to have a moment or get off the pot, stop writing. It was one of those. I was like, this isn't bad, but it's, it's unremarkable. And then the last 50 pages floored me, knocked my socks clean off. The last 50 pages was so unexpected, so like horrendously vile and nasty. Like it was disgusting and perverse, and oh, did I love every moment of it. That clearly says something about me. But yeah, it really went there, and I had a lot of respect for it to have that conviction, and to completely flip every opinion that I had about this book up until that point on its head. Like, I can't remember the last time that a book did such a 180 in the third act. Like, it was a real Hail Mary. I was floored. It made a lot of sense when I looked into it and saw that Bret Easton Ellis had written this book when he was 21. I was like, oh, that's why the first three quarters are so like insular and lacking. It's because like he's the same age as me. He hasn't lived life, and a book of this scale requires a bit more experience, I would argue. People can say like, oh, well, Fitzgerald wrote This Side of Paradise when he was only 23. It's like, yeah, but not everyone can be Fitzgerald. And this definitely has some half-formed ideas that I wish had come to their true fruition, The main one for me was definitely like, there's kind of like a very tiny grief subplot, because the main character, Clay, he lost his grandmother to pancreatic cancer. And so me reading this as like a 21-year-old who lost my grandmother not that long ago, I was like, oh, something to hold on to. I can relate to this. Let me identify with you, character. But then it never... the emotional impact of that was never fully realised, and I found that to be frustrating, especially when I reflect on like The Catcher in the Rye. That book really helped me come to terms with losing my granddad, because that book handles grief so well. The way that Holden Caulfield is constantly asking people, but in winter, where do the ducks go? When the pond in Central Park freezes over, what happens to the ducks? Like, that's such a beautifully creative and symbolic way of showing here is a young person and trauma has affected them. They have lost someone and they are never the same. And I wish this book had taken a leaf out of that. But again, not everyone can be J.D. Salinger. Something that really jumped out immediately about this, because this was my first experience with Bret Easton Ellis, and while I've heard things about him, I didn't really know what to expect of his writing style. I like his sense of humour. There's definitely a bit of satire that leaps out in this. The tone is very tragicomedy, like it's so dark, but in this irreverent way that you can't help but laugh at it. Everything felt so flippant and tasteless. Like, there's no subtlety, no subtext. It really just drops it all at your feet and you have to take it. And I have a lot of respect for that, because I feel like that level of like shameless like horror, it's something that modern writing perhaps doesn't appreciate as much. Because if you didn't know what Less Than Zero is about, it's essentially quite a vivid parody of LA, life in Los Angeles, especially in the 1980s. Everyone is blonde and tanned and promiscuous and queer. Everyone's abusing drugs, particularly cocaine. It's so, like, everyone's trying to make it in, like, the big city. They all want to make it big in acting or models. They want to be famous. But, of course, these very young people are being exploited by the ones at the top, and it felt very now while also being like a nice sort of look at a period, because the 1980s, even though it wasn't that long ago, it's definitely like a time and a place that's interesting to look at now. Something else as well that I really enjoyed about this book was that it represents lots and lots of queer men, but across the complete spectrum of like morality. Sometimes I feel this way, especially about modern LGBTQ plus books. They they look at the queer experience either in such a rose-tinted way where you're meant to think that every gay person is lovely and like rainbows come out of their butt, or it's like a very depressing, gnarly tragedy where it's like, don't you feel bad for them? Look how much they suffer. They're so persecuted for just being themselves. This book, it was never about them being queer. Like that, their sexual identity, their sexual preference didn't define them. They were just drifting, and they happened to like boys, like girls, like whoever. And there were also some rotten gay people, which I really appreciated, because you know what? Gay people are no different to anybody else. You can get some gay people who are terrible, terrible people, and they're in this book. And I thought that was so real, you know? You could tell Bret Easton Ellis, he didn't care if it upset someone, the representation of like queer people being like these abusive pimps. Like, he just didn't care, because it was like, you know what, it happens, and their sexuality is irrelevant. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. That spoke to me. So then we get to the ending, and to be honest, I can't really do it justice, because the nature of TikTok, there are many things that happen in the end that I just can't talk about on here, and I could probably come up with a bunch of code words like we're a bunch of 4-year-olds and, you know, break it down, but I just think that's unnecessary. Just know that the ending is shocking and upsetting, and it won me over. I was like, okay, book, you're not as dry as I thought you were. Like, the ending, you hit me just when I needed it. You really gripped me. Do I think that the topic of disaffected youth going into indulgence, going into addiction, do I think that pipeline is very overdone? And there are lots of books that I've read that do it better. Absolutely. But if I appreciate that Bret Easton Ellis was 21, he wrote this in the 80s, you know, back when literature and pop culture, the zeitgeist wasn't as oversaturated as it is now, I can appreciate this for what it is. And what it is that was a lot of is very impressive, okay? And I'm fairly confident that I'm going to have to read more from him, because I liked it. I did like it.